I have no doubt that nearly all of you have a plan. When disaster strikes and you've lost anything from, let's say, a file all the way up to a location, you at very least have at least an idea of what you need to do, right? If not, of course, having a detailed and complete plan. But even if you have a pretty well-oiled backup and DR machine, as it were, there's still a lot of places where you can optimize it. And optimizing, of course, has its benefits. You get speed, you get efficiency, recoverability, there's an assurance it's going to work, and the list kind of goes on and on. And so the question kind of becomes, what should you be doing to optimize your current plan? And so on today's webcast, I'm joined by Brad Jervis. He's Senior Cloud Architect at Offsite Data Sync. He's both a Veeam Vanguard and a VMware vExpert, and he's mostly concentrated and spends his time in the backup and disaster recovery space. So, hey, Brad, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem, Nick. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited about this.
Yep, it should be a good time. So Brad and I are going to take a look at 4 specific areas of your backup and DR plans and discuss some ways to optimize them. Now, this isn't a normal kind of presentation that you might be used to. Rather than, let's say, death by PowerPoint, which you're probably used to seeing on most every other webcast, there are a total of, I think, if I count the list down here, I think there's a total of 7 slides, including the one that you're looking at right now, the title slide, for the entire presentation. It's mostly focusing on a conversation, one that we'd like you guys to participate in. So as we go through this discussion that Brad and I are having, you may not see a slide deck moving forward. That's okay. That's kind of normal here. I want you to sit back, relax, enjoy the conversation that we're having. And at the same time, there is the Q&A box that's in there. We'd love for you to participate in the conversation. So if you've got a question, a comment, an anecdote, I don't know, a joke, I mean, anything that you think would actually contribute to today's conversation, by all means, stick those in the Q&A box. I've got it up here in front of me and be happy to include you in on the conversation with us. And as always, there'll be some time at the very end for Q&A if there's any questions that either weren't appropriate or didn't seem to fit in, or maybe I didn't happen to see them in enough time. We'll certainly have some time at the end to make sure those get answered as well. So the place we're going to kind of start with is just simply the fact that there is some room for optimizing your DR plans or DR strategy. Now, according to the last report from the Disaster Recovery Journal and Forrester, this is actually a 2018 number, but they haven't yet come out with a 2019 report. So the last number they had here, you can see that the overwhelming majority of organizations like your own have some kind of backup and DR plan and strategy in place. So that's good. That's good news right now. I'm glad, again, that you're here because you're thinking about how ways we can optimize that. And we're going to talk about some very tactical ways that it could be done here. But at least you have something in place. I'm hoping this is representative of the audience here in today's webcast. Now, with every one of these plans, there are a couple of goals to the strategy that we want to talk about. You, of course, want to have the ability to recover. That's one of the strategies you're trying to figure out, what do I need to back up so I can recover? And I know this is some of the stuff that's already I'm just kind of walking through the logic, making sure we level set everybody here. But there's also some that get a little more advanced than just, let's say, recovering a backup. In a lot of cases, a lot of you are thinking more about resiliency. You're thinking about that ability to bounce back and get operations back up and running the way that it was as quickly as possible. And it's a little more of a strategic level of thinking. Some of you still might be thinking tactically, where you are thinking about, I have server X, as it were, and I have backups of server X, and I can recover server X. I mean, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Resiliency is just a little bit of a higher level kind of approach to the whole thing, where now you're thinking about, from an operational standpoint, how do I make sure that everything that's necessary for the business can be resilient, can get back the way it was beforehand, which if you take that to an even sort of greater extent, you're really thinking probably more about availability. How do I keep it running all the time? In some cases now you get from maybe different kinds of strategies. Let's say on the beginning of this, it might have just been simple backup or recovering, versus where you get to something closer to availability. You might be looking for more things like, let's say, replication. So it's just a very fast failover and you're back up and running within, let's say, 5 minutes. So it really kind of depends on the goals, but there are several of these different goals, and they might be at varying amounts within each of your strategies. And again, each one of you in this webinar today has different goals, different strategies, different ways of approaching it. But in the end, no matter what you're trying to accomplish here, there is that opportunity where there is some room for improvement. So we're going to talk about 4 specific areas here. This is not on the slide, but I do want to kind of make sure that we cover this. We're going to talk about backup as a service. We're going to talk about disaster recovery as a service. We're going to talk about including cloud-based SaaS applications, and we're going to use Office 365 as the example here. And then we're going to talk about leveraging managed services and look at all those ways that you could utilize to optimize the DR and backup strategies and plans that you have in place today. So we'll start with the first one, which is backup as a service. Now, there are a couple of ways and that Brad and I are going to kind of talk about here. And we'll put them up on the screen. We'll have a bit of a discussion about it. And I see kind of three ways that you can optimize backup as a service. If you're utilizing it, the first one is just going to be the backups that you use themselves. Some of you might be doing image level. Some of you might be doing file level. Really depends on what your goal is in terms of your recovery strategy. If you're thinking about, I just need to recover systems, we certainly all know that image is going to be the best way to do it. But if there's a real specific need to be able to recover a separate data set, thinking about file level backups or having a plan to use your image level backups so you can extract the files out, that's certainly still acceptable. But thinking about what you're really trying to accomplish with the recovery side of backup as a service and thinking about the optimization that goes on, the amount of data that is being passed through on a given backup, all those kinds of issues might come into play when you think about image versus file level, so kind of keep that in mind. The next thing is doing fulls versus incrementals. There's some great technology advancements. And I know ODS and partnering with Veeam, they've worked together over the years and come up with some really great ways using incremental backups that very, very quickly recover an entire system. So making almost full backups not entirely necessary in a lot of ways. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. There's another issue of just having speed, and that's really kind of revolving around the fact that you're trying to leverage deduplication and compression technologies. There are settings for that inside, let's say, Veeam and other kinds of backup applications where doing deduplication very specific ways, doing compressions in very specific ways for the data sets involved help optimize and therefore speed up both the backup process and the recovery process. And then the last part here is the issue of storage. Since we're talking about backup as a service, there's an assumption using the cloud for storage. And there are multiple storage tiers that exist depending on the the storage vendor being utilized. There's as many as I think I've seen 4 today in use. 4 different, everything from what effectively is called hot storage. It's the stuff that you need to get access to right away today, getting colder and colder until you actually get to like a cold storage or a deep cold storage, or sometimes they're called archive storage or whatever. That's basically, it's a really slow storage, very slow retrieval time. There's actually a very slow, even getting access to the actual media is included in that time frame. It's very slow. It's for something that's just be archived. It's probably never going to need to be recovered, but it could. But utilizing that does a couple things. Primarily, what you might be concerned with is optimizing your spend so that you don't need everything in the hot storage, which typically is a little more expensive than the cold storage, but if there's something I'm never going to touch, I might stick it in cold storage. So there's a couple of these ways we want to talk about today about optimizing backup as a service. So Brad, I think I've done enough talking, so maybe I can ask a couple of questions of you and bring into the conversation here. I've got these 3 things I've listed here on the screen, and maybe of those, which do you see as being the most done wrong? I don't know if that's the improper English, but which one is being done most incorrectly? There we go, with customers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I want to say it's going to be number 2. So that's going to be, the speed of your backups. A lot of customers will come to us and say, hey, look, I've got terabytes and terabytes of data, but I only have a 25 megabit internet connection that I'm going to use to actually back this data up to the cloud or wherever you might be going with it. And obviously that's going to be our primary bottleneck. So it's very important to actually look at what's involved with the deduplication and compression technologies. So one of our biggest partners, Veeam, has some great technologies, and there's a lot of different levels that you can select. Obviously, the higher you go on deduplication and compression, you're going to be talking about more CPU, more memory usage on your backup server, but you're going to be reducing the amount of data that you're actually going to send over that pipe. So you're going to be able to actually back up more and more of your data, be able to recover more and more of your data, but the amount of transit or bits that are going over the wire are going to be greatly reduced at a cost of that CPU and memory. So if you have kind of low bandwidth, it's very important to kind of make sure that you size your backup, especially backup copy jobs with Veeam, to be actually, have higher deduplication, have higher compression ratios, just to squeeze as much as we can out of that bandwidth, because that's going to be our bottleneck for, I'd say, most of our customers.
That's an interesting sort of, what's the word I want to use? That's sort of, it's not a handoff, but it's a trade-off, there we go, between, we're normally thinking about, I need the speed, I'm trying to get as much as I can through the pipe, get it up to the cloud, that sort of thing. But obviously, if you decide, okay, well then let me just maximize the duplication and compression, and effectively, depending on the processing power that's available, it could actually be slowing down that process, because the bottleneck becoming the machine doing the deduplication and compression. I'm hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. I mean, it's always going to be a trade-off, like you said. It's always going to be about what you have available, what your bottleneck's going to be, and most backup technologies have a great way to actually identify what your backups are and be able to offer you some kind of solution as far as being able to get around that bottleneck. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a hard limit for CPU memory consumption or bandwidth, you're always going to have to deal with that. So it's just a matter of, doing whatever you can to make sure that you can get that data off-site.
Perfect. So what else have I not covered? It's obviously not a comprehensive list on the slide, but what are some of the other things I didn't cover that you think are areas of concern when optimizing backup as a service?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of things that we should probably think about are whether or not you have a fully virtualized environment or whether you have a physical environment as well. A lot of our customers still have some of these legacy applications where either the vendor says, you can't virtualize this, or maybe they're in the process of virtualizing it. So you have to kind of design your backup strategy to ensure that both your physical and virtual workloads are getting backed up, and ideally have everything under a single pane of glass. That just creates ease of management, ease of flexibility. You have the, kind of one-click restore from anywhere that you go. And there's a lot of products out there that do that. I think that Veeam is probably kind of top tier with that, with the release of their Windows and Linux agents. There's a lot of great features and functionality, and you get it all under a single pane of glass, which is going to be great. You can log in and see, cool, my physical backups worked, my virtual backups work, everything is good. And I know that I can just look at that one single thing rather than having a whole checklist of going, okay, well, let's check on this physical server backup, let's check on this virtual server backup, everything else. So I would say that that's another critical thing when talking about optimization. Optimization, we're talking about saving time, saving resources. By keeping everything under a single pane of glass, we're saving that time, we're saving those resources, and we're making sure that our engineers have enough time to, rather than just be checking up on backups, that they can go in and do some things that are going to be productive for the company. Okay? So I would say that's probably the biggest one, I would say, that we're not necessarily missing, but just kind of a good thing to mention.
I'd agree, and also the single pane of glass, the ability there to do something quickly about it, no matter what it is that's being backed up. So that whole point of checking the backups, and so when you see a backup failed, single pane of glass helps optimize the addressing of the problem, right? As proactively as possible before it ever becomes an issue later on, should the recovery be necessary. So I like that. Let's talk about DRAS a little bit. Talk about disaster recovery as a service, and just like with the last slide, there are a couple of ways that you can optimize disaster recovery as a service, and it just sort of depends on where you're at and in the process and what parts you're responsible for, those of you in the audience here. And the ones that I'm thinking of here, I got 4 of them here. The first one is just the issue of building a plan. A lot of times, I've 25 years in IT. I owned an MSP in a previous life. And I mean it figuratively, not literally. And back in the 1400s, I owned it. No, I didn't know that. Just teasing. It's figuratively. And but yeah, so I know that the idea of planning sometimes, we tend, as technologists, we tend to run home to mama and we think about the tech. And we go, okay, what can my backup software do? What can my cloud storage do? And we start with the tech and we work toward a solution. As opposed to the optimizing methodology is starting with the business and looking at the business needs, figuring out what it is that the business requires, and work towards technology. You mentioned Veeam as one of your strategic partners. Veeam has a term that they like to use, the availability gap. And it's basically you look at what the business requirements are, then you look at what your technology can do, and then you go, what's that big chasm in the middle? where we're not able to have our current technology meet the requirements of the business. That's the availability gap. And that's part of that process of planning. Is the optimizing is starting with the business, figuring out actually what the business needs you to do. You might be, for example, you're backing up great backups, consistent backups every day of some critical tier 1 workload, but then you find out that the business actually has, let's say, a recovery point objective of no less than, I'm just making up something very tiny just for the sake of making the point. Let's say it's 5 minutes. Well, by definition, if I'm going to have a recovery point objective of 5 minutes, I can't have backups that run every hour. I have to have backups that run every 5 minutes because I have to be able to recover to 5 minutes ago. So, starting with the business is actually really important because you got to figure out whether or not your technology can do it or not. Another issue here is testing. And testing is something that kind of falls on the wayside. That disaster recovery journal and the Forrester report I mentioned from last year has some great information in it where you find, I don't have the stats in front of me, but where you find that a lot of organizations aren't even doing testing, or the most they do for testing is what they call tabletop testing. It's basically we get the plan out and we run through it together. And they everyone, hey, high fives each other. Yeah, we pat ourselves on the back. Okay, something got a plan, but nobody actually knows if it works. And so the optimizing that I see is really necessary, although I'm painting a really rosy picture of the end result. It's a lot of work to get there, is you've got to do two things. One is backup verification. That's actually probably relatively easy. That could be part of a backup solution like Veeam that does that and will verify the backups to make sure they work. Backup verification could be making sure that the data has integrity and it can be recovered from. It could be that it's actually recovering, let's say, a system and booting it up. It could be recovering the system, booting it up, and doing some kind of other test, like it's a ping test or seeing if a service starts. So, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to do testing from a verification standpoint. And then the other one that's a little tougher than that is a recovery simulation. This could be as small as something that is probably more like that backup verification, like recovering a single system and trying something out. But a real full-blown recovery simulation would be, let's say, if let's take the sake of argument, you or a customer of yours, if you're an MSP, you have an on-premises Exchange box. Well, an Exchange system is going to require Active Directory. So if you're going to do a true simulation of recovery, you'd have to recover the Exchange boxes, Active Directory, make sure they work, probably at least have a client, whether it's a full-blown Outlook client or just someone uses like web access or whatever the case is, and test that it actually works. I mean, that's a recovery simulation. It'd be everything and in between those two, single system to kind of a more complex workload and everything in between. But that is another way to do optimization. Another one is looking at the tech that you're using today. So if you're still using tape, probably very few of you are using tape today. Most organizations are using disk at this point. But even if you're just, let's say, using on-premises disk and you're not using cloud-based storage, that could be a shift in technology that could help. Maybe even if you're using an old backup solution and you want to use something that's a little more modern day. The example that Brad gave earlier, maybe some of you might have physical workloads, some virtual workloads. Maybe you don't have a single solution that supports both. So looking at the tech. And then one of the most important things is probably the use of automation. This kind of goes back to some of that testing because some of that testing can be automated depending on what kind of orchestration tool you have. But also in the actual disaster recovery itself, when the stuff hits the fan, you've got to recover in anything from a file, a single workload, a complex workload, an entire environment, the whole operation, whatever it is. The more complex the environment to recover, the more you need automation to actually create sort of a run book, an orchestrated script of everything that has to happen so that dependencies are in play. My example of Exchange and AD, we know that AD has to come up first. In order for Exchange to work, but for AD to work, you have to have DNS working, and you start having these dependencies. Automation takes care of all that and ensures a consistent and accurate recovery scenario and execution, if you will. So, Brad, a lot of ideas here in optimizing. How often are you seeing customers creating DR plans that are based on probably, I'm going to start kind of at the beginning here, where they're starting with, they base their plans based on more on tech, the tech that they have, rather than the needs of the business?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and you mentioned a lot of awesome stuff here that we can certainly get into. But I think that a lot of the customers kind of say, okay, well, if I can get my tech up and running, then I've become available. But that's not always the case, and I would like to say that it's pretty critical in our industry to kind of shift the paradigm of saying, well, my technology is up, it's running. let's say I have a terminal server up or something, but if my users don't know how to access it, or let's say I have to, go in and interact with each one of my users on every single endpoint, and if I have, 200 users who are working from home to try and connect into this environment, I wouldn't say that my business is actually up and running or available in this case until each and every one of those critical users has access to their data and is able to work. So with that, we're kind of pushing our recovery time objective quite a bit because we're saying, listen, our recovery time objective isn't actually being met until our last critical user has access to that data. And I think that for a lot of DR plans that are out there right now, we might not really be considering that. Maybe we could say, okay, well, we have this alternate DNS name to connect to this terminal server, yada, yada, and that gets up and running. It's up and running in maybe an hour. Boom, we're good. Our recovery time objective is met. But if we have to go then and contact each one of those users and their email might be down, or they might need to reconfigure their phone or Outlook settings or whatever it might be to connect to that DR email, maybe we need to wait for DNS propagation, whatever it might be, if we need to go and touch each of those users and we've actually had to spend an hour going through connecting with each of them and educating them on how to access that environment, I would say that we haven't met our recovery time objective. I'd say that our recovery time objective is probably closer to 2 hours because people aren't working, the business isn't generating income. Obviously, it always depends on the business, but this is one of the big things when I talk to customers personally that they kind of say, hey, I really didn't think about that. I really didn't think about users accessing it. They're not able to work, we're not able to generate revenue, and we're still losing money even though our systems are available and running.
It's a great point. I had a customer of mine that was a very large security service that they provide guards everywhere at all the different businesses you see guards. And I live in South Florida where we have, we're in Hurricane Alley, so disaster recovery is a big issue here. And I've actually been through a number of scenarios where like complete loss of operations. Had to literally put drives into boxes on pillows in a car and put servers and yank them out of racks, put them in other people's cars and drive stuff up to Orlando from Fort Lauderdale. This is a time before the cloud was really accessible as a means by which to recover. But this customer who's got the security, to your point about your RTO really is when you get the last customer going. They had a massive number of different recovery scenarios available, including their corporate building is like facing the major highway here, I-95, that runs north and south. Meaning you can just look over the little wire fence that's on the edge of the highway, and there's the parking lot that's probably 3 rows of cars deep, and then the building. Very, very close to the highway. And they even had a plan for if they had a chemical spill right in front of their building, like right at the highway, in case like a tanker overturned or whatever, and they had to evacuate the building. And what's interesting to your point is they did not have sort of an endpoint portion of their DR plans. I'm like, well, what happens? How are you going to get people to connect to it? It's great. It's really not functioning that. You have a bunch of servers that are talking to each other, but nobody can talk to them, so what's the point? So I love that you bring that up, because I think that really is important. And I just want to add it to your comment to what you're saying about you having testing to make sure that every last user of the environment can connect, and then you really can consider your RTO done. For you guys in the audience, if it's a customer-facing app, you obviously at least have to test to make sure your customers can access it as well. So kind of keep that in mind. Brad, let's talk about testing a little bit. I talked about 2 different areas of optimizing testing. What's the most common mistake you see customers making when it comes to testing their DRaaS?
Honestly, you brought it up before, and that's going to be we're not allowing our services to boot up prior to our maybe dependent services booting, right? So as you mentioned, we want to make sure Active Directory gets booted up and running before we start our Exchange servers or basically anything else that might be using a service account. That's the biggest one that I've seen folks do is they say, oh yeah, it'll come up and what have you. But one of the things that I've seen a lot is Active Directory really does not like to come up sometimes, especially if you have a large domain with lots of domain controllers. A lot of time you'll get Active Directory spinning up and it'll be in a kind of non-working state. You have to go in, maybe edit some registry keys, restart some services, maybe see some FISRO roles or what have you before you're actually able to get that up and running. So a lot of times what I'll recommend for people is start your Active Directory domain first, or whatever dependent services that you might have. Start that up first, get that running, and then start your database servers, SQL, whatever it might be, and then go through and actually start the rest of your application servers, or even your file servers, or all the other ones that have those dependencies. That's the biggest one I've seen, and once we actually go through and do DR testing, we actually make sure that we document in that DR plan, make sure this is running first, and then start these services. Then start these services once we make sure that those are running. So it's all about documentation, because at the end of the day, you don't know who's going to be available during a disaster. Maybe you ran through and you've documented this DR plan and you have it on your personal laptop, and lo and behold, you're down in, I don't know, maybe Key West or something, no cell phone service, you left your cell phone in the hotel, there's a huge disaster back in your office, you don't know what's going on, have no way of knowing, and they have no way of having any of those steps that we've already done and performed. So that's another thing, is make sure that whatever you test, whatever you fix, that's documented, that's in your DR plan, and that there's no single copy of that DR plan, and especially there's no single copy of that DR plan locally, because if you need to use it, it's local, you're not really going to have it. So those are a few of the big ones.
Yeah, one of the organizations I worked for, we had, we used the term nuclear football. I think it's sort of for the idea of the president with the box, the button in it, but the keys. But we say every executive in the organization had to have a copy of the nuclear football, and it was basically the DR plan. And that way, if anybody was, sipping margaritas in Margaritaville, listening to Jimmy Buffett or whatever, to your point, there were like 6 other executives that all had a copy of the thing. So one way or the other, somebody had a copy of the thing, and we knew what to do. So that I completely agree there. Let's talk a little bit about, shifting gears, about Office 365. And I'm actually wondering, you guys in the audience, I mean, the stats say about half of all organizations today are using Office 365. And so I'm just wondering, if you guys are using Office 365, you can just stick something in the Q&A box, just give me a yes and hit submit. It's obviously not a question, but it's okay. I just love to, or if you're not, say no, and that's fine too. Just trying to get a sense of the audience here. But thank you again. We one already starting in. Thanks, Chris. So got a couple of you that are actually saying yes. Some are saying no. But for those of you that are using it, so those of you who are not, you can ignore the next, I don't know, minute and a half, 2 minutes or whatever. The rest of you need to be paying attention here. The first optimization is the fact that you have to actually include this in your DR strategy. I've actually written a couple of different white papers for ODS on this topic. I've written a number of ebooks on it and spoken on it at a couple of conferences, and I know it well, a Microsoft MVP. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. Microsoft does not provide backups at all. They back it up themselves for the purpose of them being able to make sure their services are available. But in sort of a shared cloud services model, they will tell you very clearly you are responsible for your data. And the simple way to be thinking about it is this. Like Tony mentioned, one of our audience members here said, no, he's not using Office 365. Tony will tell you, if I was to ask him, and he could actually talk, which he can't, if I say, Tony, who's responsible for backing up your Exchange box on-prem? And Tony would go, me, right? He has to back up his own data. The only difference is you're borrowing somebody else's server. It's still your data. So who's responsible for backing up that data? You. You are. Just like Tony is for his on-prem, you guys are all responsible for your data. Now, it's unlikely, but it has happened. I think it's happened twice in the last 6 months even, where Microsoft it's known that they've actually lost some data. Some stuff got corrupt. So it has to be included. And some of the data sets, more or less in general, you see here, are going to be things like the Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive. This list is ever expanding. It's all kind of based off of what Microsoft is writing APIs and to make it accessible. So not everything in Office 365 is even accessible yet to backup, although you might see some vendors that are doing some very odd backups, and they might claim, we're backing up whatever service it is. It's something that nobody else is inside of Office 365. But if they're doing that, you have to be asking, how are they doing it? Because sometimes they use things like migration APIs to do it, which are very inefficient, don't necessarily have a chain of custody to them, things like that, and it becomes a little questionable if that's going to be something that is scalable for you if your company was to fully invest in whatever that extra service is. So you're looking for stuff that's really backup API focused. And then you want to be thinking about how often do you want those backups done. I'm going to guess that most of you don't have backups of Office 365. That's where most organizations are, because it's kind of that thinking, and we all are sort of guilty of it. We just think, oh, Microsoft's doing it, and they're not. And so you got to think about what recovery point objectives do I want. Again, that idea of starting with the business objectives and working back to technology, that's going to help you decide, well, how much of Exchange Online, for example, how much can we really be down? The CEO might say, I can't lose more than 15 minutes with the email, and I have to have it back up and running, or whatever it is. You have to start thinking about this thing, and based on the recovery point objectives of these data sets as a whole, and even the data sets in smaller subsets, like that example of the CEO's one mailbox, he or she may actually have a very different objective than everybody else. You're going to have to think about having backups that meet that need. Brad, are you seeing prospective customers kind of missing this opportunity to protect Office 365?
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into that, and one of the things that comes with Office 365 protection is you actually protect against malicious users who may be deleting, evidence or what have you. A lot of you might be under legal obligations in order to maintain copies of this data. Microsoft, doesn't fulfill those legal obligations, so you have to actually maintain those copies of this data. Whether you get, asked for some of it down the road or what have you, you don't want to go and say, oh, well, I thought Microsoft Office 365 was taking care of it. It turns out I can't get it. That no one's going to have a good day if you have to use that answer. Another thing I just want to mention is that pretty much for what you were saying, Nick, any of these software as a service applications, it is your data and it is your responsibility to protect it. So we're mostly talking about Office 365. I know Tony said he's not using it, but as he thinks about maybe some applications to move to, certainly something to think about, that this is your data, you're responsible for handing it over when someone comes and asks you to restore it, someone comes to ask you and say, hey, I need access to this, or even in the disaster recovery kind of thing, if Microsoft goes online or what have you, you might need to have some alternative ways that you can provide email to your customers, especially because right now I think email is really one of the primary forces that drive business and drive the decisions with business. And I would say that most customers, if your email's at a standstill, business ends up being at a standstill. So it's one of these things, especially with Office 365, that you really want to consider and really want to make sure that you have maybe highly available, but more importantly, backed up, and that you can recover some of this data even a month, 2 months, years down the line. You want to be able to actually take that data and say, okay, well, this email was sent to this person, I have this proof, and I can deliver it to whomever may be asking for it.
So that's a great scenario, just this idea of someone maliciously deleting files that they don't want to be seen anymore. Are there any other scenarios you've seen that are the cause for recovering Office 365 data?
I mean, honestly, it's plain user error. Sometimes maybe someone will submit, hey, delete this user's mailbox, and the IT admin goes in and says, oh, no, I didn't mean him, it was autocorrect or something. Please go back and restore that one. And, you say, well, there wasn't really a backup of it, so I can't restore it. Granted, there are some protections inside Office 365 for this, but, they're very few, they're very minimal, and they don't really provide too much of an SLA. So if, in my mind, I'm thinking let's protect this and let's protect it against that inevitable human error. I mean, listen, we're all humans. I've made tons of mistakes in my life. I'm sure you have as well, Nick. And I think probably everyone listening certainly has as well. And if you haven't, well, you might at some point down the road. So let's make sure that we have an insurance policy. So, even if we do make a mistake, we can recover from it.
Yeah, I personally never made a mistake ever, but yeah, but thanks for.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So I'm also thinking about some scenarios where that you mentioned the built-in. You've got basically like a cycle bin instead of like Exchange, an example, and that's basically deleted out of retention time is where it comes down to. You got some legal holds, you've got archiving. This is all just in the case of like Exchange Online, but even that's not backups. Those are ways of sort of retaining data, and the other problem is by default the retention times are very short. So if we're talking about, for you guys in the audience, we're looking to recover data that is maybe 3 months old or 6 months old or a year old or whatever, you're not going to find any of that available with the built-in native default settings that exist within the Microsoft realm. Brad, what specific data sets are you normally recommending to customers that should be included in their backups?
I mean, pretty much whatever is required by your business. If you're one of those folks who's using OneDrive and that's your primary file share, then you definitely want to make sure that's getting backed up. obviously email. But if, SharePoint Online for you is something that is, not necessarily critical, you can potentially forego backing that up. You're not going to lose too much data. Maybe it's just something like, just kind of a not necessarily chat, but some kind of, message board or what have you. Maybe you don't back that up, or maybe you don't back it up as much, whereas email, you want to make sure that that's getting backed up fairly regularly. Same thing with data, things like that. So I would say that it's pretty critical to make sure that you get all of those critical applications, and it's going to depend on your business and what's really most vital for you guys to make sure that you get back up and running as quickly as possible. So I would say that we have a pretty good coverage of it right here on the slide, but it's always going to depend on the business. Customer A is going to always be different than customer B. So it's just a matter of ensuring that your business objectives are going to be met in the event of some sort of disaster or the fact that you need to restore it.
That's a good point. There actually is, if you guys want to see like an interesting demo, this is probably closer to the FUD side, so there's a nice little full disclaimer here. But if you go look up Ransom Cloud, all one word, there's a demo by renowned hacker Kevin Mitnick. I've actually watched this done live, and he shows basically how, I don't know if he had it built or if he just got a copy from someone else, but basically it's an application through a phishing technique where someone gets sent an email that looks like it's from Microsoft that says, hey, we're going to upgrade your antivirus on your Outlook, click here to do it. And what it actually is a piece of software that then goes to Office 365 and says, hey, can I have access to your, to protect your Office 365? I'm going to install this security thing. And instead what it's actually doing is you're just giving the app, this actually the rogue hacker app, access to your mailbox. And then when it does it, it goes through and encrypts every single message in your mailbox, one by one. And if you look at you click on any one of them, it'll show you in a preview. It'll say like this file's been encrypted. It's basically ransomware inside Office 365. It's not something that's entirely probable, but it's interesting to see, that's for sure. To think that somebody could do something like that, something malicious, that it is possible. And certainly if you give someone access to your mailbox by being tricked to do something, maybe not you, but one of your users, being able to recover that would be kind of important. So kind of half FUD, kind of more like, it's possible, but I'm definitely trying to characterize it as such, that it's possible but not necessarily probable. But Ransom Cloud, and it's kind of interesting to look at. Let's talk about our last topic here, which is optimizing using managed services. Now, I've got 4 different kind of areas that are up here. Most of this sort of makes sense to you guys just by looking at this: planning, using managed services for planning, for testing, for the recovery environment, for the process. The idea here is, one, you guys have a lot on your plate already. And I know this because I make my living as a technical evangelist, and I always see my job as just sort of coming up with the abbreviated version of what's coming up and going on in the industry, giving you industry stats, and industry data, trends, that kind of thing. Why? Because you have a lot on your plate. You have no time to do it. So I have a living because you guys are busy. I know that. That also tells me that you don't necessarily have the expertise in the DR side. Can you recover, let's say, I'm going to pick on Tony because Tony said no, he has an on-premises Exchange box. If that's the case, if Tony's got that box, he knows how to recover it. I'm fairly certain he knows how to recover a box. Pretty easy. But yeah, he may not have the expertise in trying to get the entire environment up and running. No pressure, Tony. I'm not trying to pick on you. You probably do, but maybe not. But most of us don't, because we focus on the services. We're going to keep them running. We know how to keep the applications running, that sort of thing. But we may not know how to actually plan and execute a disaster recovery type of scenario. So that's where managed services comes into play. Whether it's ODS or anybody else, having help with coming up with a plan to make sure it's comprehensive. Certainly with the testing, again, I'm not a fan of tabletop testing. I think if you're doing nothing else, then yes, do it. It's at least something. But if you can, doing some real testing, probably closer to where you're doing the simulations, that's probably a better kind of a way to do it. The recovery environment, being able to have the recovery environment established, spun up, ready to go so you can recover into it, and or the recovery environment might be actually infrastructure as a service that is, let's call it dedicated or maybe semi-dedicated. Maybe it's dedicated in terms of maybe using replication to copy real critical things, like we've been talking about Active Directory as the example between Brad and myself today. Maybe that's already replicated into that environment, that sort of thing. And then the actual process of performing some kind of DR or recovery scenario. because they have that expertise, they've seen the things that go wrong and so on, keeping in mind that any kind of managed services is probably more an expert on the recovery process, but not necessarily every single app that you have in-house. So there's still just a need for you to know that part of it, and there's a need for the managed services provider to help you with that aspect of it. Brad, what are some of the challenges you find that customers maybe have that could serve as indicators for the audience that using managed services might be a good help for them or good fit for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I kind of live and breathe disaster recovery and backup and things like that, and I've helped probably close to 100, 150 customers with their disaster recovery. So a lot of times with DR, it's really difficult because you may have never, and it's funny difficult about this, but you may have never, or if you have, very rarely actually brought up your entire environment from scratch. If you think about it, a lot of times maybe you'll be performing some updates or something and you'll reboot certain servers and they'll all come up in different ways or what have you, but very rarely do folks actually take down the entire environment and then boot everything up one at a time from scratch. And especially because you might be in a DR environment or something like that, there might be some driver issues, there might be some AD issues, there might be any number of problems that you may run into. Maybe this was configured with a temporary configuration, and after rebooting the server, it doesn't come up. So you might need to do some troubleshooting, see what someone who was in the company years ago did. Especially with regards to environments that you inherit, that you kind of say, okay, I know how to manage this, but I didn't configure it, and if I really need to troubleshoot it, I might be relying on vendors or something like that. So if any of that applies to you, your best bet is to make sure that you enlist the help of some experts, at least to help you with the DR plan, to run through the disaster recovery process, to ensure that your documentation is done right, to ensure that it's done correctly, and also completely up to spec, to ensure that if someone has to pick up that DR plan and has no idea about the environment, that they can go in and say, well, I've never touched this before, but I know I need to do this on this server, I know I need to do this on this server, and then I need to restart this service, and then things are going to be working. So I would say that a lot of it is going to come down to just relying on expertise, at least for the initial development of that plan, and then utilizing some of the skills that you learn from the engagement to make sure that from here on out you develop processes as far as when you add new servers, you update your DR plan. When you add new servers, you update your backups. Make sure they're included in your backups. Or better yet, you have some sort of automation in place that's going to automatically include them in your backups. Whatever might be done down the line, it's your job as an administrator to make sure that you're future-proofing not only your environment, but the recovery of that environment. Every time something changes, you need to make sure that you're going to have the capacity to add that to your DR plan, add that to your backups, and to make sure that whatever might happen down the road, you're going to be covered in the event of any kind of disaster or backup requirement.
Great answer. Now, you touched on a couple of different places where managed services can assist, and it kind of augments the list I've got here and covers some of the things I'll also cover here as well. But which is the most critical, just from your own experience with customers, what's the most critical kind of aspect of utilizing managed services, the most critical part of the process to get right that they should be thinking about optimizing with a partner?
That's going to be the process. By and large, the process. You need to make sure that your process is ironclad. You need to make sure that everything is documented, as I said before, and documented well, so that anyone who has any sort of technical skills, if you're unavailable, they can pop in and they can do whatever they need to do to get that environment up and running. And a lot of people just kind of document and say, oh, yeah, make sure this service is running. And if I log into your environment having no idea what that service even is, my question is, okay, well, what server is that on? Is it a regular Windows service? Is it something else I need to go and start? Is it some other application? How do I make sure it's running? There's tons of questions that come into it, so it's all about documentation. It's all about process, because in the event of an actual disaster, you want to assume that it's not going to be you actually running the DR. It's going to be someone else who may have never touched that environment before.
Good perspective. Let's do this. Let me sum things up here, and I know you've got a couple of slides. And then if you guys have any questions, make sure you stick those in the Q&A box, so we'll be happy to answer those. So just kind of summing this up a little bit here, the goal here is to make sure that you're optimizing what you have in place today, figuring out how to get it even better than it is today. And there's an old quote, you see it here, you guys have read this before, but the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And the idea is that you've got these plans, you've got this idea in mind of how it's supposed to work. You have a lot of documentation. Some of you even done some testing. I mean, I guess most of you probably haven't done simulation testing of your plans, but some of you maybe have. But yeah, no matter where you're at in that spectrum, there's an opportunity to do some aspect of it and make it some aspect optimized on there. And in every case, if you notice, what we were suggesting is basically a little more detailed of a focus of your plan, looking at very specific things like, for example, the deduplication and the compression. And it might be looking at very specific backups and how are they being optimized? How are they being compressed? How are they being deduplicated? Is it optimized? Is it light? Is it a much deeper? And the idea is that's really what this comes down to, is you taking a look and stopping and go deeper dive into everything to figure out where can you find parts to increase efficiencies and therefore operational availability. In some cases, you might need to leverage some expertise. You heard this whole idea about in the last slide about the idea of using a managed services provider. That's going to help throughout the entire process, everything from the assessment all the way to the execution and everything in between, if it's something that you're not sure of. Again, if you know how to recover a server and it's one server, yeah, that's simple. But I think you said it well, Brad, when you said, I'm going to guess that not many people on the call have actually recovered an entire environment before. That's something that even when I was doing IT full time, just like you guys in the trenches, I was probably willing to try it and make sure when I'd never done it. Done a bunch of testing of different aspects of the environment and so on to make sure things work, but not necessarily, hey, everything has gone to hell. Please go and recover it somewhere else. That's a pretty big step. So think about this a little bit. Obviously, take this back and apply it to your environment. And Brad, like I said, I know you've got a couple of slides, so why don't you go ahead and you can take control. And while Brad's covering that, if you've got any questions about anything we've talked about today or what Brad's going to cover here in just a moment, stick that in the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to answer that once Brad's done. So Brad, take things away.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So everyone, I'm going to kind of breeze through this just because we are running a bit low on time, but a lot of a part of your DR strategy is going to make sure that you choose the right provider, especially if you're talking about, you wanting to store your data in the cloud or a colo or what have you. So it's going to be, where's that data going to be stored? Is it far enough away? If you have a regional disaster, is your data going to be affected as well by that? If there's a hurricane, I'm up here in New York City, and we recently got, or not recently, but a few years ago, we got hit by Hurricane Sandy. If your data might be sitting on Long Island or in New Jersey, and your main office is in downtown Manhattan, well, both places might have been affected by that problem. So you want to make sure that your data is stored somewhere that's far enough away while still being accessible to you. Also, you want to think about, how is your data backed up? Are we just backing it up? Are we replicating it? Is it getting backed up in a secure way? Is it going to the right data center, to the right place? These are very important things to think about when trying to choose a provider. And also, how quickly can that data be restored? Does your provider have the amount of bandwidth to be able to restore that data in a reasonable manner? Can you max out your pipe to be able to pull it back down? Is there a good way to restore that data while still working in the DR environment to minimize the amount of downtime? These are all questions you need to be asking about how to choose the right provider. And so at Offsite Data Sitting, we think that we're that right provider. We really take pride in our work in the disaster recovery and backup fields, and for the sole reason is this is all we do. We are a DR and backup company. There's a lot of our competition out there, and they have other items. This is all we care about. These are what our users, our employees are trained in. These are what our engineers are trained in, and we're used to doing this every day and all day. So we really consider ourselves best in breed as far as DR providers. I'm not going to go through all these. You can read them yourself, but I'm just going to touch on some of the key ones. We're 2 times Veeam Partner of the Year. Veeam is a great technology, a great partner of ours, and they really offer a phenomenal product, and we integrate with them so well that it's just a beautiful thing. It's so easy to get done, and it's so easy to recover that it's just crazy. Experienced, and we're one of the largest Veeam Cloud and service provider partners globally. We have tens of thousands of physical and virtual machines under our protection currently, and we want to make that way more because we think that we have the expertise and we're the right partner for this. Secure and compliant, you name the acronym, we're there. we have credential professionals. You name the acronym, we have our experts that have whatever credential acronym they might have. We're forward-thinking, and we also do professional services at a fair market rate, and we have a global presence serving North America, EMEA, and APAC markets currently, and we're looking to expand that out a little bit. So keep listening for some additional webinars here. So with that in mind, I just want to say thank you so much, Nick, for hosting, and thank you everyone for being here. Nick, I'll let you take it away if you have any kind of Q&A questions or anything that we want to cover.
Yep, looks like actually there's no questions. If you guys do have one, you can feel free to answer that. You will notice up on your dashboard a couple of poll questions have popped up here. You can feel free to answer those. That's just to provide a little feedback to the folks at Offsite Data Sync. We'll wait another question or so. But in thanking me, I want to thank you as well, Brad, because that was a great conversation. I think some really good insight. I'm hoping you guys in the audience actually got some real good, interesting insight into what you might be doing and get your thinking. That's really what our goal is today, is to elevate the way you think about approaching the problem. It's obviously impossible for us just to sit over here on this end of the webinar and just go, oh, if you just check that one box, everybody's backups and DR strategies will be so much better. It doesn't work that way because everybody is a completely different environment. So our goal today was really just to elevate the way you think about it, spend an hour with us, focused on that, try to figure out then how you could take that and go work on your own environment. So I hope that was great. Brad, thank you for the input today.
My pleasure, Nick. Thanks for having me.